When you find something hidden in a tree, it's usually a bird's nest or carved initials. But what a wildlife researcher found inside an old-growth tree in Olympic Park was different. It was a journal, and the last entry, written 9 days after a mother and daughter vanished, contained only one sentence. Mom was right. We should never have followed it. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The word "it" had been violently scratched out, and beneath it, Sophie had tried to write something else. The pen had pressed so hard it tore through 3 pages. Whatever she was trying to say was completely illegible. Rachel Miller had been trying to fix things with her daughter for months. Sophie was 15, and their relationship had become what Rachel called a war of silence. They barely spoke at dinner. Sophie stayed in her room. Rachel didn't know how to reach her anymore, so when Rachel's therapist suggested a mother-daughter wilderness trip, she booked it immediately. 3 days in Olympic Park, no phones, no distractions, just them. Sophie didn't want to go. She made that clear from the moment they parked at the trailhead on September 14, 2020. While Rachel checked their gear with nervous energy, Sophie sat on a log with her arms crossed, staring at the ground. But Rachel had hope. She had to. This trip was supposed to be their reset button. The first day was exactly what Rachel had feared. They hiked in silence. Sophie walked 10 feet behind her mother the entire time, earbuds in, even though there was no signal. When they reached their campsite near Elk Lake, Rachel tried to start a conversation about the trees, the water, the sunset. Sophie gave one-word answers. That night they ate freeze-dried meals without speaking and went to their separate tents, but something changed on the second morning. Rachel woke to find Sophie already up, sitting by the lake with her journal. When Rachel approached, Sophie didn't pull away. She actually smiled. It was small, but it was real. They made breakfast together. They talked about school, about Sophie's art, about nothing important and everything important at the same time. By afternoon, they were laughing. Rachel felt something she hadn't felt in months, hope that they would be okay. That's when they saw it. They were on an unmarked trail, taking what Rachel thought was a shortcut back to camp, when Sophie stopped. She pointed into the dense forest. There, about 30 feet off the path, was something that didn't belong. It looked like a structure of some kind. Branches arranged in a pattern, forming what almost looked like an entrance, but it wasn't natural. Someone had built it. Rachel's first instinct was to keep walking, but Sophie was already moving toward it. "Wait," Rachel called. Sophie turned back, and for the first time all trip, she looked excited. "Mom, come on. Let's just see what it is." Rachel hesitated. Every rational part of her brain said to stay on the path, but Sophie was smiling at her, really smiling. And Rachel couldn't bring herself to ruin that moment, so she followed. The structure was stranger up close. The branches were woven together in a way that seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. There was a small opening, like a doorway, leading deeper into the forest. Sophie crouched down and peered inside. "There's a path," she said. Rachel looked. She was right. Beyond the structure, the trees opened slightly, forming what looked like a trail. It wasn't on any map, but it was there. "We should head back," Rachel said. Sophie stood up, and Rachel saw something in her daughter's face. Disappointment. The wall was going back up. "You never want to do anything," Sophie muttered. It was the same tone that had poisoned their relationship for months. Rachel felt it all slipping away again. "Okay," Rachel heard herself say. "Just for a few minutes. But we stay together." They stepped through the opening. The forest changed almost immediately. The trees were older here, more densely packed. The light was different, filtered and green. The trail they followed was barely visible, more of a suggestion than a path. But Sophie was ahead of her, moving with a confidence Rachel didn't understand. "This is so cool," Sophie called back. Rachel tried to share her enthusiasm, but something felt wrong. The air was too still, the forest too quiet. After about 20 minutes, Rachel stopped. "Sophie, we need to turn back. We don't know where this goes." Sophie turned around, and Rachel saw frustration flash across her face. "We're fine, Mom, don't you trust me?" The question stung. That was the problem, wasn't it? Trust, or the lack of it. Rachel wanted to say yes. She wanted to prove that she believed in her daughter. So instead of insisting, she nodded. "Okay, but just a little further." They kept walking. The trail twisted deeper into the forest, away from anything familiar. Rachel tried to keep track of their turns, but the path was confusing, doubling back on itself in ways that made no sense. When she finally insisted they stop, Sophie agreed without argument. They were both tired, but when Rachel turned to head back the way they came, she realized something that made her stomach drop. She couldn't remember which way they had come from. The trail looked the same in every direction. Sophie saw it in her mother's face. "Mom?" Rachel tried to stay calm. "We're okay. We just need to retrace our steps." But as they walked, nothing looked familiar. The forest seemed to close in around them. The light was fading. Rachel checked her compass, but it was spinning erratically, unable to find north. Panic started to creep into her chest. They walked for hours, or what felt like hours. Time became strange under the canopy. Sophie stopped talking. Rachel kept apologizing, kept saying they would find their way back. But the forest was endless. When darkness finally came, they had no choice but to stop. They had some supplies, a small emergency kit Rachel had insisted on bringing. They made a cold camp, no fire, huddled together against a fallen log. That night was the longest of Rachel's life. Sophie didn't cry, but Rachel could feel her daughter shaking. "I'm sorry," Rachel whispered. "I should have said no. You were right to be mad at me." Sophie didn't respond for a long time. Then, quietly, "I'm the one who wanted to go. This isn't your fault." It was the kindest thing Sophie had said to her in months, and Rachel hated that it took this to hear it. The next morning, they tried again. They walked in what Rachel hoped was the direction of the lake, but the forest seemed to shift around them. Landmarks they thought they recognized turned into dead ends. The compass was still useless. By midday, they were lost in a way that felt absolute. That's when Sophie pulled out her journal. She wrote while they rested, and Rachel didn't ask what she was writing. She was just glad Sophie had something to hold on to. On the third day, Rachel started to accept that they might not make it out. They were out of water. The food was gone. Sophie was getting weaker. They had been walking in circles for so long that Rachel no longer trusted her own sense of direction. When they finally collapsed against a massive old-growth tree, Rachel knew this might be the end. Sophie leaned against her mother, and Rachel wrapped her arms around her. "I love you," Rachel said. Sophie nodded against her chest. "I know." What happened in the days after that remains unclear. The official search began on September 18th, when Rachel and Sophie failed to return from their trip. Park rangers found their car at the trailhead and their abandoned campsite near Elk Lake. Everything was still there. Their tents, their gear, Rachel's phone. It was as if they had simply walked away and never came back. The search lasted 3 weeks. Over 200 volunteers combed the area around Elk Lake. Helicopters scanned the forest. Search dogs picked up a scent trail but lost it after half a mile. There was no sign of Rachel or Sophie, no evidence of where they had gone or what had happened. The case went cold. The Millers were added to the growing list of people who vanish in national parks every year without explanation. 5 years passed. Rachel's husband, David, never stopped looking. He returned to Olympic Park every season, walking the trails, calling their names into the forest. He put up flyers. He hired private investigators. But the forest kept its secrets, until March 2025, when a wildlife researcher named Dr. Claire Hendricks was conducting a biodiversity survey 17 miles north of Elk Lake. Dr. Hendricks was examining an old-growth Douglas fir when she noticed the hollow. It was about 6 feet off the ground, partially hidden by moss. She almost missed it, but something made her look closer. Inside the hollow, wedged between the wood and the tree's inner cavity, was a leather journal. It was weathered, water-stained, but remarkably preserved. When Dr. Hendricks opened it and saw the name Sophie Miller written on the inside cover, she immediately contacted park authorities. The journal contained entries from the entire trip. The early pages showed Sophie's frustration, her anger at being forced on the trip. But as the days progressed, the tone changed. She wrote about talking with her mother, about feeling heard for the first time in months. The entries were hopeful. Then they stopped on September 16th. There was nothing for 5 days. And then on September 21st, there was one final entry. Just one sentence. "Mom was right. We should never have followed it." But beneath that sentence, barely visible, the word "it" had been scratched out with violent, heavy strokes. And underneath, Sophie had tried to write something else. The pen had pressed so hard into the paper that it tore through not just that page but two more beneath it. Whatever she had tried to write was completely illegible, just deep gouges in the paper and scattered desperate marks that formed no recognizable letters. The discovery of the journal raised more questions than it answered. The location where Dr. Hendricks found it was impossible. To reach that area from Elk Lake, Rachel and Sophie would have had to travel 17 miles through some of the most dangerous terrain in Olympic Park. The route would have required crossing two major rivers, scaling a steep mountain pass, and navigating through dense forest with no trails. There was no logical reason they would have gone in that direction, and no way a 15-year-old girl, lost and starving, could have made that journey. Forensic analysis of the journal confirmed the timeline. The final entry was written 9 days after Rachel and Sophie were last seen, which meant they had survived for over a week in the wilderness. But how? And why would Sophie have climbed a tree to hide the journal in a hollow? What was she trying to protect it from? The FBI brought in handwriting experts who analyzed the scratched-out word and the illegible writing beneath. They determined that Sophie had been under extreme psychological distress when she wrote that final entry. The pressure of the pen, the frantic scratching, the torn pages, all pointed to someone in a state of panic or terror. But terror of what? David Miller read his daughter's journal and broke down. The progression from anger to hope to that final desperate sentence destroyed him. He demanded answers. He wanted to know what it was. What had his wife been right about? And what had Sophie tried to write before she gave up and tore through the pages? The search resumed. This time, teams focused on the area where the journal was found. They searched in expanding circles from that old-growth Douglas fir, and 3 days into the renewed search, they found something. About a quarter-mile from the tree, hidden under a thick layer of forest debris and 5 years of decomposition, they found a makeshift shelter. It was constructed from branches and moss, barely recognizable as human-made, and inside, they found Rachel's jacket. The jacket was torn and weathered, but it was definitely hers. David identified it immediately, but there was something else. Carved into the wood of one of the shelter's support branches was a message. 4 words, scratched in crude letters. Do not follow the path. The pieces started to come together. Investigators theorized that Rachel and Sophie had indeed followed that strange branch structure on their second day. They had become disoriented in the forest, just as Rachel had feared. But instead of finding their way back to their campsite, they had continued deeper into the wilderness, possibly believing they were heading toward safety. The compass malfunction that Rachel likely experienced was not unusual in that area. There are pockets of Olympic Park where magnetic anomalies can cause compasses to spin uselessly. Over the following days, as they became more desperate and disoriented, they had pushed further from any marked trail. The route they took, reconstructed from the journal's location and the shelter, showed a pattern of increasingly erratic movement. They were likely suffering from dehydration, exhaustion, and the early stages of hypothermia at night. In that state, rational navigation becomes nearly impossible. They would have been moving on instinct and desperation alone. The shelter they built showed that Rachel at least maintained some survival sense. She had tried to create protection for them. The message she carved suggested that she knew they were lost because they had followed something they shouldn't have. She was warning anyone who might find the shelter not to make the same mistake, but by that point, it was too late for them. The journal's location, 17 miles from their starting point, suggested that after Rachel died, and evidence indicated she died first, possibly from exposure and exhaustion, Sophie had continued moving. Alone, terrified, and likely delirious, she had wandered further into the wilderness. At some point she had climbed the tree, perhaps seeking higher ground to see a way out, or perhaps trying to escape something she perceived as a threat. And there, in that hollow, she had written her final entry. The scratched-out word and the illegible writing beneath told investigators everything they needed to know about Sophie's final mental state. She had tried to explain what happened. She had tried to write what it was that they had followed, but in her desperate, deteriorating condition, she couldn't form the words. Or perhaps she realized that it didn't matter anymore. The it wasn't some monster or supernatural force. It was simply their own poor decision. The trail that wasn't a trail, The path that led nowhere. Sophie Miller's remains were found 2 weeks later, 3 miles from where the journal was discovered. She was lying at the base of a ravine, partially covered by years of fallen leaves. The medical examiner determined that she had likely fallen while trying to navigate steep terrain in a weakened state. She had died from the impact and exposure. Based on decomposition patterns and the journal's timeline, they estimated she had survived no more than 2 days after writing that final entry. Rachel's body was found a month later, closer to the shelter. She had likely died of hypothermia and exhaustion. The positioning of her body suggested she had simply laid down to rest and never woken up. She had been dead for 5 years, less than 8 miles from where her car was parked at the trailhead. The official report concluded that Rachel and Sophie Miller had died as a result of disorientation, exposure, and poor navigation decisions in Olympic National Park. The strange branch structure they had followed was likely a natural formation that they misinterpreted as a trail marker, or possibly something built by other hikers years before that had been long forgotten. It didn't matter, but for the investigators working the case, one question refused to go away. If the branch structure was just a natural formation or an old trail marker, why had it been built in that specific location? And why did 3 other missing persons cases from Olympic Park over the past 15 years all share one disturbing detail? Detective Sarah Chen from the King County Sheriff's Office had been reviewing cold cases when she noticed the pattern. In 2008, a solo hiker named Marcus Webb vanished near the same area where Rachel and Sophie were last seen. In 2013, 2 college students disappeared during a camping trip 6 miles from Elk Lake. And in 2017, just 3 years before the Millers, an experienced outdoorsman named Richard Torres went missing after telling his wife he was going to explore an interesting structure he'd seen off-trail. None of their bodies had ever been found, until Sophie's journal surfaced. Chen requested permission to reopen all 4 cases as potentially connected. She suspected that the branch structure wasn't random. Someone had built it deliberately, and it had been luring people off marked trails for years. But when park officials searched the area where Rachel and Sophie had initially left the path, they found nothing. The structure was gone, or it had never been there in the first place. This discovery troubled Chen more than it should have. She interviewed dozens of hikers who had been in Olympic Park around the same time as the Millers. Most remembered nothing unusual, but 3 hikers, all experienced backpackers, mentioned seeing something similar. A formation of branches that looked almost like an archway or a doorway. One hiker, a man named Paul Gresham, remembered it clearly. It looked deliberate, he told Chen, like someone wanted you to notice it. My wife wanted to check it out, but something about it felt off, so we kept walking. Chen asked him to describe the location. He did. It was nowhere near where Rachel and Sophie had disappeared. It was 12 miles west, in a completely different section of the park. Chen felt her stomach tighten. She asked another witness, a woman named Jennifer Yates, to describe where she had seen a similar structure. Jennifer pointed to a map. Her location was 15 miles north of Paul's. 3 different locations, 3 different structures, all described the same way. The possibility that someone was deliberately building these formations throughout Olympic Park, specifically designed to lure hikers off trail, was too disturbing to ignore. But why? And how had nobody noticed a pattern until now? Chen brought her findings to the FBI. Agent Michael Torres, no relation to the missing Richard Torres, took over the investigation. What he discovered in the following weeks would change how the National Park Service approached missing persons cases forever. Agent Torres requested satellite imagery of Olympic Park going back 20 years. Using advanced image analysis, his team searched for unnatural patterns in the forest. What they found was shocking. Over the past 2 decades, at least 17 different branch structures matching the witnesses' descriptions had appeared throughout the park. They weren't permanent. Each one seemed to exist for a few months before disappearing, and every single one was located within a mile of where someone had gone missing. But here's what made it even more disturbing. The structures weren't built to lure people to dangerous areas. They were built in perfectly safe locations. The danger came from what happened after someone followed the path beyond the structure. Because there was no path. People who investigated these formations weren't walking into hidden ravines or unstable ground. They were simply walking into deep forest with no clear route back, and in their confusion they went further and further from safety. Torres interviewed a wilderness psychology expert named Dr. Amanda Price. She specialized in understanding how people become lost in the wilderness. What she explained gave the investigation a new direction. When people see something that looks man-made in the forest, Dr. Price said, they assume it means civilization is nearby. They assume someone built it for a reason, that it leads somewhere, so they follow it. And once they're off the marked trail, their sense of direction degrades rapidly. The human brain isn't designed to navigate dense forest. We need landmarks. Without them, we spiral. The branch structures were essentially psychological traps. They didn't need to lead anywhere dangerous. They just needed to convince people to leave the safety of marked trails. After that, the forest did the rest. But this raised an even darker question. If these structures were being deliberately built to lure people off trail, then someone was responsible for at least 17 disappearances over 20 years. Someone who understood the psychology of lost hikers. Someone who knew Olympic Park intimately, and someone who had never been caught. The FBI launched a task force. They brought in profilers, park rangers, and wilderness experts. The profile they developed was chilling. They were looking for someone with extensive knowledge of Olympic Park's geography, someone physically capable of traveling deep into the wilderness to build these structures, someone who understood human behavior well enough to know exactly what would make a hiker curious enough to investigate. And most disturbing of all, someone who had been doing this for at least 2 decades without leaving any evidence behind. Tips started coming in. Former park employees, suspicious hikers, people who claimed to know something. Most led nowhere, but one tip from a retired park ranger named Douglas McKay gave Torres something concrete to work with. McKay had worked in Olympic Park from 1999 to 2018. He remembered something from his early years that had always bothered him. In 2001, a junior ranger named Ethan Caldwell had been fired for inappropriate conduct. Caldwell had been caught off duty, deliberately giving tourists incorrect directions on unmarked trails. When confronted, he claimed he was teaching them a lesson about relying too much on technology and not enough on their instincts. McKay had pushed for a full investigation, but Caldwell had resigned before it could proceed. He had disappeared from Olympic Park, and nobody had heard from him since. Torres tracked Caldwell down. He was living in Forks, Washington, just 30 miles from Olympic Park. He was 53 years old, physically fit from years of hiking, and according to neighbors, he still spent most of his time in the forest. When Torres and his team interviewed him, Caldwell was calm, almost amused. He denied building any structures. He denied luring anyone off trails. But when Torres mentioned the Millers, something changed in Caldwell's expression. "I read about them," Caldwell said quietly. "The mother and daughter. That was tragic." Torres watched him carefully. "Did you build the structure they followed?" Caldwell smiled. "I don't know what structure you're referring to." Torres pushed harder. "We have satellite evidence. We have witness testimony. We know someone has been building these things for 20 years, and you have the knowledge, the ability, and the history of misleading hikers." Caldwell leaned back in his chair. "You know what the real problem is, Agent Torres? People don't respect the wilderness anymore. They walk into a national park with their phones and their GPS devices, and they think nature is just another theme park. They don't understand that the forest doesn't care about them. It doesn't owe them safety. So when someone gets lost, everyone blames the park. They blame the rangers. They never blame the person who ignored every warning sign and wandered off trail because they thought they knew better." Torres felt his jaw tighten. "So you decided to teach them a lesson?" Caldwell shrugged. "I didn't decide anything. I'm just saying that if people want to ignore boundaries, ignore warnings, ignore common sense, then maybe they deserve to learn what the forest is really like, without guardrails." It wasn't a confession, but it was close enough. Torres obtained a warrant to search Caldwell's property. What they found in his workshop turned the investigation from theory into evidence. Photographs, dozens of them. Each one showed a different branch structure in Olympic Park. Each one was dated, and next to each photograph was a notation, coordinates, and dates. The dates matched almost perfectly with when hikers had gone missing in those areas. But there was something else in the workshop. A journal, Caldwell's journal, and in it he had written extensively about his philosophy. He called it natural selection for the modern age. He wrote about how soft civilization had made people, how they had forgotten that nature was dangerous, how the only way to remind them was to create situations where their assumptions would be tested. He wrote about watching hikers from a distance after they discovered his structures. He wrote about how some turned back, listening to their instincts, and he wrote about how others, the ones who thought they were smarter than their fear, kept going. He never explicitly admitted to building the structures with the intent to harm anyone. His journal was filled with justifications about education and natural consequences. But the pattern was undeniable. Every structure he photographed, every date he recorded, corresponded with someone going missing, including September 15th, the day before Rachel and Sophie Miller disappeared. The coordinates matched the area where they were last seen. Ethan Caldwell was arrested on April 3, 2025, and charged with 17 counts of reckless endangerment resulting in death. The prosecution argued that while Caldwell might not have physically harmed anyone, he had deliberately created conditions that he knew would result in hikers becoming lost and dying of exposure. He had documented his actions meticulously. He had watched it happen, and he had never called for help, not once. The trial began in September 20. David Miller attended every day. He sat in the front row, staring at Caldwell, waiting for something, an apology, an explanation, anything that would help him understand why his wife and daughter had died. But Caldwell showed no remorse. When asked why he had built the structures, he said simply, "Because people need to remember that actions have consequences." The defense argued that Caldwell hadn't forced anyone to leave the trails. He hadn't touched anyone. He hadn't directly caused any deaths. But the prosecution presented Dr. Amanda Price's testimony about psychological manipulation. They showed Caldwell's journal, his photographs, his detailed records. They demonstrated that he had knowingly created a trap and had watched people walk into it year after year without ever intervening. The jury deliberated for 6 days. On October 18, 2025, they returned a verdict, guilty on all 17 counts. Ethan Caldwell was sentenced to 255 years in prison, 15 years for each victim. He would never walk in Olympic Park again. He would never see the forest he claimed to be protecting, and he would spend the rest of his life behind bars, where nature couldn't teach him any lessons. David Miller gave a statement after the verdict. He spoke about Rachel and Sophie, about how they had been trying to fix their relationship, about how they had simply made one wrong choice because they wanted to connect with each other. He spoke about the journal, about Sophie's final words, and then he said something that silenced the courtroom. "My daughter wrote that her mom was right, that they should never have followed it. But the truth is they weren't just following a trail, they were following hope. Hope that they could be close again, and someone used that hope to kill them." Caldwell showed no reaction. He was led away in handcuffs, and that was the last time David ever saw him. The case changed how national parks across the country handle missing persons. New protocols were established. Rangers now conduct regular sweeps for unusual structures or markers that might lure hikers off trail. Trailhead warnings became more explicit, and a database was created to track patterns in disappearances, so no one would ever spend 20 years hunting people without being noticed. But for David Miller, none of it brought his family back. What mattered was that they had made a choice to leave the marked path, and that choice had cost them everything. David Miller held a funeral for his wife and daughter in June 2025. At the service, he read from Sophie's journal, from the entries where she wrote about reconnecting with her mother. He wanted people to remember that part, not the tragedy, but the brief moment of healing they had found before the end. He also shared Rachel's final message, the one carved into the shelter: "Do not follow the path." It became a warning posted at trailheads throughout Olympic Park. But there's something else David found in the journal that he never shared publicly. In one of the early entries, before they got lost, Sophie had written about the branch structure they found. She described it in detail, including something Rachel had said when they first saw it. Rachel had looked at the woven branches and said, "This feels wrong," We shouldn't go near it. Sophie had written that she ignored her mother because she was tired of Rachel always being afraid of everything. The final entry then takes on a different meaning. Mom was right. We should never have followed it. Sophie wasn't just talking about the trail. She was talking about ignoring her mother's instincts, about pushing past a warning because she wanted to be adventurous, to prove she wasn't afraid. And in the end, Rachel had followed her daughter because she wanted to prove she trusted her. Two people trying so hard to fix their relationship that they walked right past the warning signs. That's what makes the journal so haunting. Not what Sophie couldn't write beneath that scratched-out word, but what she didn't need to write. She already knew. They both knew. Sometimes the thing you follow into darkness isn't mysterious at all. It's just your own desperate need to connect with someone you love, even when every instinct tells you to stop. The hollow in that old-growth tree is still there. Park rangers have left it undisturbed, a natural memorial to Rachel and Sophie Miller. Sometimes hikers find it and leave flowers or notes. David visited it once, in the fall of 20. He stood there for an hour, his hand pressed against the ancient wood, and then he walked back to the trailhead without looking back. He never returned to Olympic Park again. Some places he decided should be left alone, but Sophie's journal had one more secret, something David didn't discover until months after the funeral, when he finally found the courage to read through it one last time. Hidden between 2 pages near the middle of the journal, pressed flat and nearly invisible, was a photograph. It had been folded so many times that the creases had almost torn it apart, but the image was still clear. It showed Rachel and Sophie at the trailhead on their first day, before everything went wrong. They were standing next to the park sign, both smiling. Rachel's arm was around Sophie's shoulder. Sophie was leaning into her mother, and for once she didn't look angry or distant. She looked happy. On the back of the photograph, in Sophie's handwriting, was a single sentence. "This is who we were supposed to be." David held that photograph for hours. He understood then what the journal had really been about. It wasn't just a record of their last days. It was Sophie's way of holding on to the brief moment when she and her mother had found each other again. Even as they were dying in the forest, even as fear and exhaustion consumed them, Sophie had kept that photograph safe. She had folded it carefully and tucked it into the journal because it mattered more than anything else. In December 2025, David established the Miller Foundation for Wilderness Safety. Its mission was simple: to prevent what happened to Rachel and Sophie from happening to anyone else. The foundation funded new trail markers, emergency beacon stations, and comprehensive wilderness education programs. But its most important project was something David called the Last Entry Initiative. The program trained park rangers and search and rescue teams to recognize the psychological patterns of people who become lost in the wilderness. It taught them about the decision-making errors that turn a simple wrong turn into a fatal mistake. Dr. Amanda Price became the program's lead consultant. She emphasized something that became the Foundation's core message: people don't get lost because they're stupid or reckless. They get lost because they're human. And being human means sometimes our emotions override our logic. The Foundation also created a memorial database. Every person who had ever gone missing in a national park and been found would have their story recorded, not as a cautionary tale but as a reminder. A reminder that behind every disappearance was a person with hopes, fears, relationships, and reasons for being there. Rachel and Sophie were the first entries. By 2026, the Foundation had helped implement new safety protocols in over 40 national parks. Trail cameras were installed to monitor for unusual structures. Satellite communication became mandatory equipment for backcountry permits, and rangers began conducting what they called decision point interventions, moments where they would stop hikers who seemed to be making risky choices and simply ask, "Are you sure?" It was such a small thing. 3 words. But studies showed that those 3 words reduced off-trail incidents by nearly 30%, because sometimes all people needed was someone to pause them, to give them 1 second to reconsider before they walked past the point of no return. In the spring of 2027, David received a letter from Patricia Webb, widow of Marcus Webb, one of Ethan Caldwell's first victims from 2008. When they met in Seattle, Patricia told him something that had been weighing on her for nearly 20 years. Marcus had called her the night before he disappeared. He told her about a structure made of branches that looked like a doorway. He wanted to find out who built it. Patricia had told him to be careful. He had laughed and said he would be. That was the last time she ever heard his voice. For years, Patricia had blamed herself. David understood that guilt better than anyone. He reached across the table and took her hand. "It wasn't your fault," he said. "And it wasn't mine. We loved them. We trusted them to make good decisions. And someone took advantage of that trust." Before they parted, Patricia asked David something that had been on her mind since she first learned about Sophie's journal. "What do you think Sophie was trying to write under the scratched-out word? What do you think she wanted to say?" David had thought about that question every day since the journal was found. The FBI had tried everything to recover what Sophie had written beneath those violent scratch marks. Chemical analysis, infrared imaging, pressure mapping. Nothing worked. Whatever Sophie had tried to write was lost forever. But David had his own theory. "I don't think she was trying to write a word," he said quietly. "I think she was trying to write a name. His name. Caldwell's. I think in those final moments maybe she saw him. Maybe she realized they weren't just lost. Maybe she understood that someone had been watching them the whole time. And she tried to warn whoever found the journal. But she couldn't. She was too weak, too scared, too far gone. So she gave up. She scratched it out and just wrote what mattered most. That her mom had been right." Patricia stared at him. "You think Caldwell was there, in the forest with them?" David nodded slowly. "The FBI investigated that possibility. They found no evidence. But I've read his journal. He wrote about watching people after they discovered his structures. He called it observing natural selection in real time. So yeah, I think he was there. I think he watched my wife and daughter die." Patricia joined the Miller Foundation as a board member. Together they expanded its reach, testified before Congress, and made sure that every park ranger in America knew what to look for. Unusual structures, off-trail markers, anything that seemed designed to lure people away from safety. Ethan Caldwell never gave them the satisfaction of an explanation. In prison, he refused all interview requests. He wrote no letters. He made no statements. He simply existed, locked away from the wilderness he claimed to love, with nothing but concrete walls and the knowledge that he would die there. In October 2027, on what would have been Sophie's 20th birthday, David hiked to Elk Lake one final time. He carried with him a small metal plaque that the Park Service had agreed to install near the trailhead. It read, "In memory of Rachel and Sophie Miller, and all who have been lost to the wilderness, may their stories guide us to stay safe, stay together, and always trust our instincts. Some paths are meant to be followed. Others are warnings in disguise." David placed flowers at the base of the sign and stood there as the sun set over the mountains. The forest was beautiful that evening, painted in gold and shadow. He understood why people were drawn to places like this. The peace, the majesty, the feeling that out here, away from everything, you could find something true. But he also understood the cost of that beauty. Nature didn't care about your intentions. It didn't care if you were trying to fix your relationship or prove you were brave or teach your children about the world. It simply was. And if you made the wrong choice, if you followed the wrong path, it would swallow you whole and never give you back. David walked back to his car as darkness fell. He didn't look back at the forest. He had said his goodbyes. And he had finally accepted something that had taken him years to understand. His wife and daughter were gone. But the love they had rediscovered in their final days, that brief and precious reconnection before the end, was real, and nothing could take that away from them. Some stories don't have happy endings. Some mysteries, even when solved, leave only grief in their wake. But Rachel and Sophie Miller's story wasn't just about how they died. It was about how they fought to love each other again, how they held on to hope even when everything around them was falling apart, and how in the end, that hope was both their salvation and their tragedy. The forest keeps its secrets, but Sophie's journal gave us one truth that matters more than all the rest. In her own words, in that final desperate entry, she told us everything we need to know. Not about what they followed, not about who was watching, but about what she learned too late, that sometimes the wisest thing you can do is listen when someone you love tells you to stop. Mom was right. They should never have followed it. Some questions don't need answers, and some paths should never be followed, no matter how much you want to see where they lead.